3 days ago, American warships seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. President Trump called it the largest tanker ever captured. Venezuela called it piracy. Russia demanded an explanation. And suddenly, the Caribbean feels like the most dangerous place on earth. But here's what the headlines won't tell you. This isn't the first time American warships have surrounded Venezuela. This isn't the first time the world's superpowers have circled this tiny nation like vultures. And this isn't the first time a crisis in the Caribbean threatened to ignite a world war. The last time it happened was 1902. And what America did then created a secret deal that shaped the next 123 years of history. A deal that explains everything happening right now. Most people have never heard this story. It's been scrubbed from textbooks, buried in classified archives, hidden so deep that even historians miss a connection. But if you want to understand why American warships are in Venezuelan waters today, why Russia is threatening retaliation, why this crisis could spiral into something far worse, you need to understand what happened in December 1902. Because what looks like a simple oil tanker seizure is actually the latest chapter in a 123-year-old power struggle over a single question. Who controls the Western Hemisphere? This is a story of how one forgotten crisis created a world order we're still trapped in. How a confrontation over debt payments became the blueprint for American power. And how the deal that saved the world from war in 1902 might be the very thing that destroys the peace in 2025. It begins with a dictator nobody remembers, a debt nobody could pay, and a threat that almost started World War II. In 1899, a cattle rustler named Cipriano Castro walked out of Colombian mountains with 60 men. Just 60 soldiers. No artillery, no cavalry, no supplies. 3 months later, he controlled Venezuela. They called him El Cabildo, the little captain. American diplomats called him something else, a crazy brute, and probably the worst of Venezuela's many dictators. That's saying something, because Venezuela had experienced 27 different governments in the previous 70 years. Castro had spent 7 years hiding in Colombia, running illegal cattle operations, and building a private militia. When Venezuela's government collapsed into yet another civil war, he saw his opening. He marched across the border and somehow, through a combination of tactical brilliance and suicidal courage, fought his way to Caracas. But taking power was the easy part. Running Venezuela was something else entirely. Castro inherited a nation that was economically shattered. The treasury was empty, infrastructure was destroyed, and Venezuela owed money to nearly every major financial institution in Europe. British banks had financed Venezuelan railways. German investors had built Venezuelan ports. Italian merchants had extended credit for coffee exports. French companies had poured millions into mining operations. The total debt? Over 60 million bolivars, roughly $12 million in 1902 dollars, worth over $400 million today. For a country with annual revenues of barely $6 million, this was insurmountable. Castro's solution was simple. Ignore it. When British diplomats requested meetings about repayment schedules, Castro refused to see them. Between February and June 1902, the British government sent 17 formal diplomatic notes to Caracas. Castro didn't respond to a single one. When German investors demanded compensation for factories destroyed during the Civil War, Castro told them to file claims in Venezuelan courts. Courts that he controlled. Courts that ruled in Venezuela's favor 100% of the time. When European merchants complained about losses, pro-Castro mobs would mysteriously riot in the streets, looting foreign-owned warehouses and businesses. The message was unmistakable. Venezuela's problems were Venezuela's business. If Europe didn't like it, Europe could sail back across the Atlantic. In London and Berlin, this was not going over well. Britain in 1902 was still the undisputed master of the world. The Royal Navy controlled every ocean. When Britain demanded payment, nations paid. Always. But Venezuela wasn't paying. Germany in 1902 was a rising superpower with something to prove. Kaiser Wilhelm II was building a navy to challenge Britain, expanding German influence across Africa and Asia, desperate to be recognized as an equal to the British Empire. German investment in Venezuela was substantial. German merchants dominated Venezuelan trade. German engineers had built Venezuelan telegraph lines. And German citizens had been caught in the crossfire of Venezuelan civil wars. Some had died, others had lost everything. The Kaiser wanted his money. More importantly, the Kaiser wanted the world to see that Germany could project power anywhere on the planet. In mid-1901, German Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow made a decision. Germany would use military force to collect what Venezuela owed. But there was a problem. Any military action in the Western Hemisphere meant dealing with the United States and its Monroe Doctrine, that 78-year-old declaration that America would not tolerate European colonization or interference in the Americas. So Germany approached Britain with a proposal. What if the two most powerful navies in the world acted together? What if they presented their demands backed by overwhelming firepower? Surely even Castro would have to negotiate then. Britain was initially hesitant. The British Foreign Office valued its relationship with Washington. They had no desire to provoke the Americans. But Castro's continued silence was becoming a national embarrassment. British newspapers were asking why the mighty Royal Navy couldn't collect a simple debt. British investors were demanding action. British politicians were questioning the government's competence. In August 1902, Britain and Germany reached a secret agreement. They would blockade Venezuela together. They would seize Venezuelan ships. They would bombard Venezuelan ports if necessary. They would force Castro to pay. But, and this was crucial, they would not permanently occupy Venezuelan territory. This distinction mattered because of one man, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had become president almost exactly 1 year earlier, after an anarchist assassinated William McKinley in September 1901. At 42 years old, Roosevelt was the youngest president in American history. Energetic, aggressive, and utterly convinced of America's destiny to dominate the Western Hemisphere. In December 1901, just months into his presidency, Roosevelt addressed Congress on the subject of European powers and South American nations. If any South American country misbehaves toward any European country, Roosevelt declared, let the European country spank it. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. Roosevelt genuinely believed that some nations deserved to be disciplined, that countries who refused to honor their debts invited consequences, that international order required enforcement. Roosevelt was no anti-imperialist. Just 3 years earlier, he had charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba, helping America seize Spain's Caribbean and Pacific colonies. He believed in power. He believed in strength. He believed that great nations had the right, perhaps even the duty, to shape global affairs. But Roosevelt also believed in the Monroe Doctrine with religious fervor, and therein lay the contradiction that would soon bring the world to the brink. If European powers were allowed to spank misbehaving South American countries, where did the spanking end? What stopped a temporary blockade from becoming a permanent occupation? What stopped debt collection from becoming colonization? Roosevelt had no good answer to this question. Not yet. In November 1902, Germany and Britain formally notified Washington of their intentions. They would blockade Venezuela. They would force Castro to negotiate. But they promised, absolutely promised, they wouldn't seize any territory. Roosevelt accepted their assurances. Publicly, he told reporters that this was a European matter, that America had no objection to debt collection, that the blockade would proceed without American interference. But privately, Roosevelt was doing something very different. In the harbors of Puerto Rico, American warships were gathering. The official explanation was routine winter exercises, naval training, nothing to do with Venezuela. But the man commanding those ships was Admiral George Dewey, the only four-star admiral in the United States Navy, the man who had destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay 4 years earlier, the most famous military commander in America. And Dewey hated the Germans. During the Battle of Manila Bay, German warships had hovered nearby, watching, waiting, perhaps hoping to grab some piece of the Philippines if the Americans failed. Dewey had confronted them personally, nearly sparking an international incident. Now Dewey was sailing toward the Caribbean with the most powerful American fleet ever assembled in peacetime. Coincidence? Theodore Roosevelt didn't believe in coincidences. On December 7, 1902, British and German diplomats delivered formal ultimatums to Cipriano Castro. Pay your debts immediately. Submit to international arbitration. Accept responsibility for damages to European citizens and property. Castro had 48 hours to respond. He responded by doing absolutely nothing. On December 9th, the blockade began. British and German warships seized Venezuela's entire navy in a single morning. For gunboats captured without firing a shot, German forces sank 3 of them immediately, their crews barely escaping with their lives. Castro panicked. The Lion of the Andes had been so confident that America would protect him. The Monroe Doctrine would save him. Roosevelt would never allow European warships to attack a nation in the Western Hemisphere. But American warships hadn't appeared. American protests hadn't been filed. America seemed to be allowing this to happen. On December 11th, Italy joined the blockade. Now 3 European powers surrounded Venezuela. On December 13th, British and German warships bombarded Fort San Carlos at the entrance to Lake Maracaibo. Shells rained down on Venezuelan positions. Soldiers died. Buildings burned. And still, America did nothing, or so it seemed, because while Europe was attacking Venezuela, Theodore Roosevelt was conducting a very different kind of war, a war of secret messages, midnight ultimatums, and threats that would remain hidden for the next 14 years. What Roosevelt did next would force the mightiest empires on earth to back down. It would create a new doctrine that would govern American foreign policy for over a century, and it would set in motion events that are still unfolding today in those same waters, over that same country, with stakes that are somehow even higher. On December 8, 1902, one day before the blockade officially began, Theodore Roosevelt summoned the German ambassador to the White House. Theodore von Holleben was a career diplomat with 30 years of experience. He had served in Washington for nearly a decade. He understood American politics better than most Germans, and he had been warning Berlin for months that Roosevelt was more dangerous than he appeared. Berlin had ignored him. The Kaiser believed Roosevelt was bluffing. Von Holleben was about to discover how wrong that assessment was. In the White House meeting, Roosevelt was polite but direct. Germany must agree to international arbitration of the Venezuelan debt dispute within 10 days. No occupation of Venezuelan territory. No permanent military presence in the Western Hemisphere. Von Holleben explained patiently that the Kaiser would never agree to such terms. Germany's honor was at stake. The debts must be paid on German terms. Roosevelt nodded thoughtfully. Then he delivered his ultimatum. If satisfactory assurances did not come from Berlin within 10 days, Admiral Dewey would be ordered to sail to Venezuela. The American fleet would ensure, by force if necessary, that no Venezuelan territory was permanently seized by German forces. Von Holleben was stunned. This wasn't diplomatic negotiation. This was a declaration that the United States was prepared to go to war with Germany over Venezuela. The ambassador protested. Surely the president didn't mean this. Surely this was posturing. Roosevelt smiled coldly. He meant every word. But von Holleben made a catastrophic miscalculation. He didn't believe Roosevelt was serious. He thought this was American bluster, empty threats meant to save face while the blockade proceeded. If he transmitted this ultimatum to Berlin, the Kaiser would be furious. It would look like von Holleben had mismanaged the Americans. So the ambassador made a decision that nearly started a war. He kept Roosevelt's ultimatum secret. He didn't tell Berlin. The blockade began on December 9th. Venezuelan ships were seized. Bombardment started, and Roosevelt did not back down. On December 14th, 6 days after the original ultimatum, Roosevelt met with von Holleben again. The president asked a simple question. What was the Kaiser's response? Von Holleben froze. There was no response because there had been no message. Roosevelt's expression changed. Very well, the president said quietly. It will no longer be necessary to wait the remaining days. Admiral Dewey will be ordered to sail within 48 hours. Then Roosevelt added something that terrified the ambassador. Not a word of this conversation would be committed to paper. There would be no diplomatic cables, no formal declarations. If Germany accepted arbitration, Roosevelt would publicly praise the Kaiser for his wisdom. If Germany refused, the American fleet would simply appear off the Venezuelan coast without warning. Von Holleben was now in an impossible position. He had concealed an American ultimatum from his own government. War was potentially hours away, and he would bear personal responsibility for the disaster. That night, December 14, 1902, von Holleben sent the most urgent cable of his diplomatic career to Berlin. The Americans were not bluffing. Roosevelt was prepared for war. Dewey's fleet was ready to sail. Germany had less than 48 hours to decide. The message reached Berlin at the worst possible time. Kaiser Wilhelm II was dealing with domestic political pressure, budget battles over naval expansion, and growing tensions with Britain over colonial competition in Africa. The last thing he needed was a war with America over Venezuelan debt collection. But German prestige was at stake. If Germany backed down to American threats, it would look weak. The entire world would see that Germany couldn't stand up to the United States. The Kaiser's military advisors laid out the strategic reality. The German Navy, despite its impressive size, was concentrated in European waters. Any naval battle with America would occur thousands of miles from German supply bases. American ships would have the advantage of proximity. They could resupply from Puerto Rico, from American ports along the Gulf Coast, from the Panama Canal Zone. German ships would be cut off, outnumbered, fighting with no reinforcement available. And Britain, Germany's supposed ally in this venture, was already looking for an exit. The British press had turned hostile. British politicians were questioning why the Royal Navy was blockading Venezuela alongside the Germans. Any excuse to extract Britain from this mess would be welcome. If Germany provoked a war with America, Britain would not support them. Germany would face the United States alone. The Kaiser made his decision. On December 17, 1902, less than 72 hours after Roosevelt's final ultimatum, Ambassador von Holleben appeared at the White House. According to one witness, his face was wreathed in smiles. On behalf of the Kaiser, the ambassador had the great honor to request that President Roosevelt serve as arbitrator between Germany and Venezuela. Roosevelt graciously accepted. He then publicly praised Kaiser Wilhelm for his commitment to peaceful resolution and international law. The crisis was over, but its consequences had only begun. For the next 2 months, negotiations continued. In February 1903, an agreement was finalized. Venezuela would pay its debts over 30 years, with 30% of customs revenues reserved for foreign creditors. The blockade was lifted. The warships sailed home. Castro remained in power. On the surface, it looked like a routine debt settlement. But the real deal, the one that mattered, wasn't about Venezuela at all. It was about power. Theodore Roosevelt had demonstrated that the United States would use military force to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Not just colonization, not just territorial acquisition. Any intervention that America considered threatening. This was revolutionary. The Monroe Doctrine, as originally conceived in 1823, was a negative statement. Europe should stay out of the Americas, but it carried no enforcement mechanism. It was a declaration, not a policy. Roosevelt had transformed it into something else entirely. 2 years later, in his 1904 State of the Union address, Roosevelt formally articulated what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Chronic wrongdoing may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Read that carefully. Roosevelt was saying that if Latin American nations could maintain order, couldn't pay their debts, couldn't prevent conditions that might invite European intervention, then America would intervene first. America will become the disciplinarian of the Western Hemisphere, the international police power, so Europe wouldn't have to be. This became the foundational principle of American foreign policy in Latin America for the next century. From 1903 to 1934, the United States intervened militarily in Latin American nations over 30 times. Cuba, 1906 to 1909, 1912, 1917 to 1922. Panama, 1903, supported independence movement, maintained control of Canal Zone. Nicaragua, 1909 to 1910, 1912 to 1933. Mexico, 1914, Veracruz, 1916 to 1917, pursuit of Pancho Villa. Haiti, 1915 to 1934. Dominican Republic, 1916 to 1924. Honduras, 1903, 1907, 1911, 1912, 1919, 1924, 1925. Every single intervention was justified using the Roosevelt corollary. America wasn't conquering these nations. America was stabilizing them, preventing chaos, protecting them from European exploitation. The pattern was always the same. A Latin American government would face economic crisis or political instability. American officials would warn that this chaos might invite European intervention. American forces would intervene first to prevent the hypothetical European intervention that might never have happened. Some historians call this the birth of American empire. Others call it the foundation of hemispheric security. Either way, it transformed the Western Hemisphere into an American sphere of influence as absolute as anything the British or French achieved in their colonies. And Venezuela? Venezuela became the testing ground for this new order again and again. For 3 decades after the 1902 crisis, Venezuela remained relatively stable under a succession of military strongmen. Then, in the 1920s, everything changed. Oil was discovered, not small deposits, not modest reserves, massive, world-altering quantities of petroleum. By 1929, Venezuela had become the world's second-largest oil producer and the largest exporter. By 1948, it was the world's largest exporter, period. More oil flowed out of Venezuela than any other nation on earth. Suddenly, Venezuelan stability wasn't about debt payments anymore. It was about the resource that powered the global economy. American oil companies, Standard Oil, Gulf Oil, Shell, poured billions into Venezuelan development. They built refineries, ports, pipelines, entire cities. Lake Maracaibo became an industrial zone of offshore drilling platforms. And the American government made an unspoken commitment. Whatever else happened in Latin America, Venezuelan oil would keep flowing. During World War II, Venezuelan oil fueled the Allied war machine. During the Cold War, Venezuelan oil provided a hedge against Middle Eastern instability. During the 1973 Arab oil embargo, Venezuelan oil kept American cars running. The deal was simple. Venezuela could have its sovereignty, its elections, its domestic policies. But the oil would flow north, and Venezuela would remain in the American orbit. For decades, this arrangement worked. Then came Hugo Chavez. In 1998, Hugo Chavez, a former military officer who had attempted a coup 6 years earlier, was elected president of Venezuela. His campaign promise was simple: take back Venezuela's oil wealth from foreign companies and American interests. Within 3 years, Chavez had renegotiated every foreign oil contract, demanding majority Venezuelan control. American companies that operated in Venezuela for 70 years suddenly found themselves junior partners in their own operations. In 2002, Venezuelan military officers, almost certainly with CIA knowledge, if not support, attempted to overthrow Chavez. The coup failed spectacularly. Chavez returned to power more popular than ever, convinced that America was trying to destroy him. In response, Chavez did something unprecedented. He turned to America's rivals. Russia became Venezuela's weapon supplier. China became Venezuela's lender. Cuba became Venezuela's ideological ally. Venezuelan oil, which had flowed north to America for 75 years, began flowing east to China instead. By 2006, Chavez was openly mocking the United States on the world stage, calling George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations General Assembly. The Roosevelt corollary, the principle that America would maintain order in the Western Hemisphere, was being challenged in the most direct way possible. A Latin American nation was openly defying American influence and succeeding. When Chavez died in 2013, his hand-picked successor Nicolas Maduro continued his policies. The alliance with Russia deepened. Chinese investment increased. Venezuelan oil kept flowing to anyone except the United States. American sanctions tightened. Venezuelan economy collapsed. But Maduro remained in power, propped up by Russian weapons and Chinese loans. And the question from 1902 returned: how far would America go to restore its dominance in the Western Hemisphere? 3 days ago, American warships seized an oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast, the largest tanker ever captured, according to the White House. But here's what makes this different from every other sanction enforcement action. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the most advanced naval formation in human history, is currently positioned just outside Venezuelan territorial waters. It's the largest American military presence in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. American strikes have targeted over 20 vessels in Caribbean waters since September. The Pentagon calls it drug interdiction operations. But none of the seized vessels have been found with drugs. They've all been carrying oil. Russia has deployed military advisors to Venezuela. Russian warships have visited Venezuelan ports. Russian weapon systems, including S-300 air defense missiles, protect Venezuelan military installations. China has invested over $60 billion in Venezuela since 2007. Chinese state companies buy most of Venezuela's oil exports. If Maduro falls, China loses billions and a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The echoes of 1902 are impossible to ignore. Then, European powers blockaded Venezuela over unpaid debts and seized Venezuelan ships. Now, America enforces sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports and seizes Venezuelan tankers. Then, a strongman dictator in Caracas defied the great powers, confident they wouldn't dare invade. Now, Maduro defies American pressure, confident that Russia and China will protect him. Then, Theodore Roosevelt positioned his fleet in Puerto Rico while claiming it was just for training exercises. Now, the USS Gerald R. Ford conduct operations in the Caribbean while Washington insists it's about drug interdiction. Then, the crisis came down to a simple question: would the great powers risk war over Venezuela? Now, we're asking the same question, with higher stakes. Because Venezuela today has something it didn't have in 1902, the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone. And the great powers competing over those reserves are all nuclear armed. The 1902 crisis established a principle that governed great power relations for over a century. The Western Hemisphere belongs to America, and outside powers will ultimately back down rather than challenge American dominance here. Germany backed down in 1902. The Soviet Union backed down over Cuba in 1962, eventually removing its missiles even though America had missiles in Turkey. For 123 years, the pattern held. But something is different now. Russia is not backing down. Putin has made clear that Russian support for Maduro is non-negotiable. Losing Venezuela would be seen as a catastrophic defeat, proof that Russia cannot protect its allies from American pressure. China is not backing down. The Chinese Communist Party has invested its prestige in the Belt and Road Initiative, of which Venezuela is a showcase project. If China abandons Venezuela to American pressure, every other Belt and Road partner nation will question Chinese commitment, and America cannot back down without effectively abandoning the Roosevelt corollary, the principle that has defined American power in the Western Hemisphere for 123 years. This is what game theorists call a commitment trap. All three powers have staked their credibility on incompatible outcomes. None can afford to be seen as weak. None can compromise without losing face. In 1902, the Kaiser could back down because the dispute was ultimately about money. Losing face over debt collection was embarrassing, but not catastrophic. In 2025, backing down means abandoning claims to great power status itself. The Venezuelan crisis of 1902 was one of the most consequential events in American history that nobody remembers. It established a precedent that the United States would use military force to exclude outside powers from the Western Hemisphere. It created the Roosevelt corollary that justified a century of American intervention in Latin America. And it demonstrated that even the mightiest empires would retreat when confronted with credible American military power. But the 1902 crisis also revealed something darker. Great power competition over small countries rarely ends well for the small countries themselves. Venezuela in 1902 was caught between European creditors and American ambitions. Castro had no real say in how the crisis was resolved. Venezuelan sovereignty was bargained away by powers that considered Venezuelan interests irrelevant. Venezuela in 2025 is caught between American pressure and Russian-Chinese support. Maduro has no real say in how this confrontation will end. The Venezuelan people suffer regardless of which great power prevails. The weapons have improved, the rhetoric has evolved, but the pattern remains unchanged. Right now, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Venezuela, history is rhyming in ways that should terrify anyone paying attention. 123 years ago, the world came to the brink of war over Venezuelan debt. A secret ultimatum and a willingness to risk everything prevented that war. Today, the world stands at the brink again, over the same country, in the same waters, with the same fundamental question: who controls the Western Hemisphere? The difference is that in 1902, only one side had made Venezuela a test of national credibility. In 2025, all three sides have. And nobody knows what happens when three nuclear powers find themselves in a commitment trap with no way out. The deal that saved the world in 1902 might be the very thing that destroys the peace in 2025.